His name is not Ed Harris, despite what you might see in the movie. Obvious that he came to prominence and is most famous for his role in the Apollo 13 mission. However, his legacy for NASA really goes much further back than that. After the Apollo 201 fire, the Kranz dictum was born, and the Kranz dictum basically says that we have to be focused on the ball if we're going to do this thing called spaceflight. And I'm obviously abbreviating it quite a bit, and you can lambast me for that later. But basically those values, those core values of making sure that every detail is paid attention to and done properly is what the Kranz dictum says. And obviously those things still hold true in what we do today. So I'm very honored and humbled to introduce to you all Mr. Gene Kranz. And with that, Gene, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, and it's really, this was a trip down memory lane this afternoon. For those of you that don't know a bit about my background, I sort of grew up in a place called Holloman Air Force Base, and spent 2.5 years in the desert with one of the first of the B-52s that rolled off the line. We were running a variety of programs. Basically, we were adapting defensive weapon systems for the B-52. Prior to that, I'd flown high-performance airplanes. Those would be in aircraft. I started in the F-80 Shooting Star, flew the 86, and then the 100. And after a tour in Korea, joined McDonnell Aircraft as a civilian flight test engineer, and ended up at Holloman. The program out there was very interesting. We were developing the GAM-72 Quail that used the JD-5 engines, so we did a lot of JD-5 engine testing. We had to trap these to swing out of Bombay. We did the guide vane and the fuel controller calibrations. We did a lot of the air start work for them. In addition, we did Bombay tough studies, separation studies, etc. So we had a real fine vehicle. And it was really marvelous to grow up in the business of hands-on engineering out in the desert at Holloman. In June 1960, I saw an advertisement. Our program was wrapping up at Holloman, and I saw an advertisement in Aviation Week magazine that indicated they were forming a space task group, and they were looking for qualified engineers to determine the feasibility of putting an American in space. And I thought, gee, that'd be a pretty cool job. So I set off my Form 52 government application for a job down there. About 6 weeks later, got a phone call that said, "Are you still interested?" And I said, "Sure." And then they said, "How soon can you report here?" And I said, "Give me a couple of weeks." So by the early fall, I was now at Mattingly Field, the home of NASA at that time, NASA Johnson Space, not what Johnson Space, that was the Space Task Group. And I formed in, I was entered into a pool of people because they were still forming up. They had about 100 people at that time. And some people were going to Recovery Division, others to down at the Cape for launch operations, some to flight operations. They had engineering under Max Faget. And after about 2 weeks in this pool of people doing nothing but studying the manuals and the Mercury, a guy comes up, taps me in the shoulder and says, "I'm Chris Kraft. You're working for me now. I want you to go down to the Cape, write a countdown, write some mission rules, and when you're through, give me a call and we'll come down and launch." That was the nature of the early space program. It was really a marvelous enterprise, the Space Task Group. It was comprised of 3 different types of people. You had the classical aeronautical engineers from the Langley Research Center. These are the people who designed and tested the fighters and bombers in World War II and the early jet age. But they were all universally young, because anyone over 35 didn't want to bet on their career in the space program. They spent the majority of time growing up in aviation. They didn't want it. So we had relatively young leaders, with the exception of Dr. Robert Gilworth. My boss directly was Chris Kraft. Now, mid-level management was probably one of the most interesting elements, because they were all Canadians or Englishmen. From the Crackerjack Avro Aero flight test team. At that time, the Avro Aero was the world's top performing airplane. Nothing could touch it. The F-101, which is coming along by McDonnell, basically was in the same ballpark from a standpoint of performance, but still the Aero had all of the time to climb, closed course records and everything else. But the Canadian government decided they couldn't build it, so they canceled the program. Avro laid off the entire, literally, I think there was somewhere around 8,000 to 10,000 people in the Toronto area in one day, which made the government unhappy. So about 2 weeks later, they sent people out to cut up the airplanes with welding torches. 5 of the 6 aircraft had flown and set all the world speed records. Well, this really torqued off the engineering community, particularly the flight test community. So NASA went up and hired these people. And we got the entire flight test team. Now this is mid-level management, all experienced people flight testing the most advanced aircraft in the world. I came in from Holloman, from basically American flight test, but a relatively young pup compared to the other people around us. So this was the nature of the early Space Task Group, and the chemistry of that organization was really spectacular. You saw all these 3 different ways of doing business. I came from the kick the tire, light the fire, and let's get going. The Englishmen basically were very methodical in the business of incremental flight test. And basically the top level NASA types at that time from the Langley Research Center always wanted to see more data. So this was the nature of the beast. Our world was vastly different at the time that we were forming up the Space Task Group. Our nation would soon be torn during the decade of the 60s by 3 political assassinations. The civil rights movement was just emerging within the nation. And the Cold War with the Soviet Union provided the stimulus for the space program, guided every aspect of our foreign policy. Computers existed only in laboratories. There were no global communications. And in that decade, American students would riot on the campuses. And then in 1961, a young, brash, and articulate President John F. Kennedy issued a challenge. He said, we choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. The day he issued this challenge, 1 month prior to that, we had blown up our second Atlas rocket. 9 days prior to the speech, we had launched Alan Shepard. We'd never been to orbit, and we were challenged to go to the moon with 20 minutes manned spaceflight experience. So engineers and people experienced in flight test, and this small group of 31 Canadians and Englishmen joined with the Mercury 7 astronauts at Langman Field in Virginia to form a space test group that would win supremacy in space. Our boss was Walt Williams. Walt was the toughest man I've ever known. He was more fitted to working as a longshoreman in New York or New Orleans or San Diego than leading the American space program. But in the business of aircraft flight test, Williams was a legend. He was the pioneer director of the MACA high-speed test station that today we call Edwards Air Force Base. And he's a project manager for the X-1 rocket ship that in 1947 took Chuck Yeager and the world into the age of supersonic flight. Williams' deputy was prophetically named Christopher Columbus Kraft. Chris developed the concept for spaceflight operations, directed the implementation of the worldwide tracking network, launched each one of the Mercury missions, but most importantly, he was the mentor, the teacher, and the tutor for the first generation of young people that became known as mission controllers. Mercury Control did not have a single computer. There were 3 mainframe computers supporting all of Project Mercury. 2 of these mainframes were at Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland, 700 miles north of the Cape because IBM did not trust us to operate these new machines. These were the first solid-state computers ever produced by IBM. On the island of Bermuda, we put a reliable vacuum tube computer, by the way, with a small team of 7 controllers who always launched eastward over the island, such that if we lost communications with our crew during powered flight, the team in place would tell the astronauts what to do when the engine shut down. Global communications consisted of a 60-word per minute teletype network that dated back to the days of America's Pony Express. So after a couple weeks training in spacecraft systems and operations, and after we all became very proficient in Morse code was our backup form of communication within the ground tracking network, as well as between the team on the ground and the crew in space. Once we achieved this proficiency, we sent young men to 13 tracking stations around the world. They went into the heart of Africa, they went to Zanzibar, they went to Australia, they went to ships at sea, islands in the Pacific. These were sites that were literally at the ends of the earth, and the risk to these young people was very high. because the 60s was the end of the European colonial period. Many of these countries were in a state of civil war or revolution. My controllers in Africa were twice rescued by the Nigerian army. At Zanzibar, we'd worked under the protection of the Gordon Highlanders or the Queen's Royal Rifles, who would surround the tracking station during contact periods. Bring my controllers back to the course. I became so violent at that site that we shut it down after only 3 years. But these young people at these tracking sites were eyes, our ears, and voice. As the spacecraft passed overhead, and for their age, they were given incredible responsibilities. And they grew to be the leaders of Project Apollo. When I first ventured into space in Project Mercury, and each one of our launches was a chapter in the history book of spaceflight. Our mistakes were violent, they were brutal. They were visible. 2 of our first 3 Atlas rockets exploded shortly after they left the launch pad. And we launched our first Redstone rocket. Firing command, the engine ignited, lifted 4 inches off the launch stand, then the engine shut down. Escape tower fired, went up to about 4,000 feet, and then came plummeting down the viewing stand. The senators and congressmen ran for cover. Our rocket engineers were speaking in German. We didn't understand what they were saying. We literally did not know what to do. But we were fortunate in those days because our nation understood there is no achievement without risk. And there certainly weren't any guarantees in this new business that we called spaceflight. We put 6 Americans in space in our first 2 years. There were close calls in every one of those missions, especially in John Glenn's and Scotty Carpenter's. But we got every one of our crewmen back. By the time that we had finished with the Mercury program, we had learned and had proven that man could live and could perform in space, but we learned much more. We learned of leaders and leadership. Leaders have integrity. They're teachers, they're great listeners, they're team builders, and when there's trouble, leaders are up front. We also learned a lot about ourselves in those days because many of us came in from aircraft like this, and egos were much bigger than this room, and it was tough at times to get people to work together. But we knew that success would only come as a team, so we became one. And we learned to check our ego every day when we came to work. So we moved into the Gemini program, and Gemini was designed to develop, test, and prove the technologies that we needed in order to go to the moon. One of these technologies related to the tools and the techniques we used in designing our mission trajectories. So during Project Mercury, all trajectory design was done by a series of numerical approximations. So we had a group of about 100 women. They were all mathematicians. We called these women computers. Okay? And these women would travel from our headquarters at Langley Field in Virginia down to the Cape for each one of the launches. They'd get down to the Cape, punch away at the calculators they had, write the answers down, plot it, graph paper, and these women would do this endlessly day after day just to design a Mercury trajectory. Well, this approach wouldn't get us to the moon. It wouldn't even get 2 spacecrafts around the moon. So we finally did get computers, and each one of these machines was as big as a house. I built our new first floor in the new control center we had in Houston. They could put a small 4,000-word computer on board the Gemini spacecraft. But the problem was we had no computer experience. So we went to the colleges and universities throughout our nation and brought in the young people who were working with computers in laboratories. We went to the Army Missile Command at Fort Bliss in Texas here, because the Army had been working with computers in the ground air missile program. And we took these new recruits and merged them with the Mercury veterans, and we started working in the very age of all knowledge, all technology, and all experience. Now, when we first started off in space, the Soviet Union had about a 2.5-year lead on us. But when Ed White stepped outside of his spacecraft in the Gemini 4 mission, we had now narrowed that lead down to mere months. And then on the next 2 missions, for the first time, we set American spaceflight records. First for mission duration, and then we rendezvoused 2 spacecrafts. And when we had accomplished this rendezvous, we had developed the confidence and the technologies needed to reach further into space and go to the moon. But we also continued to learn of ourselves and of our work. We learned of discipline, a focus so intense upon the objective that we would never do anything personal that would compromise achieving that objective. We also found the value of high morale because we now knew we were succeeding because of our beliefs in our mission, our team, and in ourselves. So we moved into Apollo. We were in the consoles Friday afternoon, January 27, 1967, 1 month from launch, testing the Apollo Command and Service Module. Crew members were Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. We had worked with Gus and Ed and the Mercury and the Gemini program, and Roger was a Navy rookie preparing for his first space flight, but he was already pretty well known within the ranks because he was one of the pilots who took pictures over Cuba during the missile crisis. Test that Friday hadn't been going very well. We had problems with communications, we had problems with life support. Crew reported noxious odor inside the spacecraft. Test procedures just didn't hang together. And we struggled through that afternoon, just like we did the day before in the pre-con. Frequently calling a halt in the countdown, sorting out problems, continuing on, then calling another halt until finally it got so bad at 6:27. We again shut down the countdown before we transferred from external power in the launch pad to internal power in the spacecraft. And 4 minutes after entering that countdown hold, we were startled by screams coming from our crew, and we listened to our crew's screams as they died. And with their death came anger. Anger at ourselves because we knew we were responsible for America's first space disaster. We wrote 2 more words into our vocabulary as mission controllers: tough and competent. Tough meaning we will never get shirk from our responsibilities because we are forever accountable for what we do, and in the case of Apollo 1 and our crew, what we failed to do. Competent. We'll never get take anything for granted. We will never stop learning. From now on, the teams and mission control will be perfect. We designed the badge, the emblem of the mission control team, and the price for admission to our ranks. And to wear this badge, discipline, morale, toughness, confidence, commitment, teamwork. Because as a team, we must never fail. In our line of work, much like yours, failure is not an option. In our line of business, the boss is the flight director. He has a very simple job description. It is only 1 sentence long. It says, the flight director may take any actions necessary for crew safety and mission success. That's it. During the course of a mission, there is no higher authority. And the flight director is supported by a team of between 15 and 21 controllers. People specialize in trajectories and spacecraft systems. We have facility operators, planners, procedures, writers. We have a medical doctor who looks after the ground team as well as the crew in space, and we have an astronaut who provides communication during the course of the mission. The mission controllers are young. They're generally in their early to the mid-20s, and the flight directors are in the early to the mid-30s. And in July of 1969, a team of young Americans whose average age was 26 took Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and the world to the surface of the moon, and we literally fought every step of the way to get there. When we finally shut the lunar engine down that day, we had less than 17 seconds of fuel remaining, and we were in the process of counting down to a very difficult and extremely risky land abort decision. But when we shut that engine down, when the crew walked on the surface, and when we got those guys back home, we had fulfilled the pledge that we had made to our now dead President John F. Kennedy and the crew of Apollo 1. We launched again in November, and as we left the launch pad, we were hit twice by lightning. We had 3 crewmen inside a dead spacecraft thundering up towards orbit. The only thing working was booster propulsion and booster guidance. And if the reactant valves to the fuel cells had closed, we had 2 minutes to save that mission. We voiced the instructions up to the crew to find a very obscure switch that would restore a portion of our backup telemetry system. With the telemetry online, the team could get to work. We voiced instructions up to verify reactants were flowing into the fuel cells. We brought the fuel cells back online in the power system. We secured the navigation system. Everything kept working. We got the crew up in orbit. We delayed injection to the moon by 1 rev so we could check the spacecraft out as completely as possible. And then in a very gutsy move, we decided that we would take Apollo 12 to the moon. So Apollo 13 was our 3rd lunar landing mission. 2 prior missions had been pretty sporty. We were hoping for a change. This mission would go a lot smoother for us. Crew members were Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Ken Mattingly. Lovell and Hayes were the crew in the lunar module, and they're scheduled to descend to a very rugged landing site in the moon that we called Frau Maro. Ken Mattingly was the command module pilot. He'd remained circling the moon in the mothership. But 4 days prior to launch, Mattingly was scrubbed from the mission because he had been exposed to measles, and he was replaced by Jack Swigert, a member of the backup crew. The mission's run in trust. When you turn 7.5 million pounds of thrust loose with the Saturn V, that's commitment. There's no change in your mind, no turning back from that decision. And trust allows you to make the split-second decisions very rapidly. Seek out every option that may exist. We lost an engine during the 2nd stage of powered flight. Very quickly, we looked at the remaining 4 engines. They were all go. We computed the new engine shutdown times, verified we had enough propellant to get the truck in orbit. Passed this information to the crew. Everything kept working. 2.5 hours later, we give the crew the go for translunar injection. So by the end of the second day, this crew was 200,000 miles from Earth, 50,000 miles from the surface of the moon, and we're entering a phase of the mission. We use the term entering the lunar sphere of influence. And this is the point in the mission where you cross over from the Earth's gravity to the moon's gravity. And for a short period of time of 4 hours, you have 2 mission aboard options. One comes around the front side of the moon, takes a day and a half to return to Earth. The other one goes completely around the moon, takes between 4 and 5 days to get home. But you got to make up your mind quick because time and these options is running out. My team was in the console and everything was looking pretty good. During the shift, we had had a television broadcast from the crew. And when the broadcast was completed, the families had been sitting behind me in the viewing room went home, and the next team of controllers had reported in for shift handover. Their flight director, who was Glenn Lenny, who was the leader of the black team, we used colors to identify teams in those days, is sitting next to me reading the log, preparing for handover. The final thing my team had to do is put the crew to sleep. We have a 5-page pre-sleep checklist we go through very carefully to make sure that everything on board the spacecraft is properly configured prior to the start of the sleep period. We got down to the final item. And this final item poses a question: do we require a cryostor? The fuels we use on board the spacecraft are cryogenic oxygen and hydrogen, super dense, super cold liquid vacuum insulated tanks at incredibly low temperatures. These cryogenics react with the catalyst in a fuel cell to produce electricity. As a byproduct, they produce water and also heat. So this is an energy and water resource we need to go to the moon, operate the vicinity of the moon, and return to Earth. So they're enormously important. 2 days into the mission, however, I've used some of these cryogenics, and if I could look inside the tank right now, I'd see a 2-phase condition, part liquid, part gas. And this results in a tank that has unequal pressures inside that particular vessel. So it's very difficult to regulate the inlet pressures to the fuel cells and to the life support system. So the designers put a fan inside the tank we would turn on to stir this mixture up, and they had a heater they used to raise the pressure. This is what a cryostor was all about, fans on, heater on. Jack Swigert acknowledged our request for the stir, and they looked behind him, and coming from through the tunnel from the lunar module was Fred Hayes. Then two switches. Now nothing happened for 16 seconds. And then inside oxygen tank 2, a spark jumps between the fan and the heater assembly, and the pressure in that tank rises very rapidly over the next 6 seconds until it blows the dome of the tank off. When the dome came off the tank, the insulation surrounding the tank caught fire, and fed by the oxygen, it was like a blowtorch racing through the bay of the spacecraft, tearing out the instrumentation and the plumbing and the electrical systems, and shocking valves closed until the pressure increased to the point that blew the side of the spacecraft off. And when the side came off, the area surrounding the spacecraft was enveloped in a cloud of debris from the explosion. We did not know an explosion had occurred. It's 55 hours, 55 minutes, and 4 seconds from launch. My voice loops call out. Hey, flight, we got a computer restart. No, the controller may says main bus on. Third one calls out antenna switch. And then down from the spacecraft below call, hey, Houston, we got a problem. So began the saga of Apollo 13. And I could go through this in exquisite detail, but over the next 15 minutes, I won't say there was utter confusion in mission control, but we just could not get a handle on the problem. And I personally went through 3 different phases at that time. When I first heard that, we had had 2 minor electrical problems on my shift. So as soon as they heard main bus on, well, aha, another electrical problem, we've seen these before, we'll wait till we put the crew to sleep, we'll work the problem. About 4 minutes later, one of my controller calls up and says, Flight, you know, the crew reported a pretty large bang associated with that. Well, now I went into the second mode, more defensively. Tread carefully lest you step on a bunch of problems. Because I had had exactly the same problem occur to me with the undocking of the spacecraft on Gemini 9, where we closed off a lot of the thruster valves from the shock. So now it's a question of, okay, quite cool. Try to get this problem nailed down. Third phase, though, was when Lovell called out. I'm looking outside the window, and I see something. I believe we are venting our oxygen. Now all of the pieces of data that we saw fit together. That had been an explosion on board the spacecraft with an enormous amount of collateral damage. And I debriefed my controllers after the mission. They described their feeling at that instant as if they were just tumbling overboard. I was a fighter pilot. Fighter pilots in that day used the term looking into the eyes of a tiger. And that is the very stark feeling that you get when the only thought on your mind is survival. It was time for my team to get going and start working the problem. Say, okay, our flight controllers, settle down, put your gas in, let's start working this problem. Electrical bus A is still good, don't do anything to screw it up. The lunar module's attached, we're going to use that as our lifeboat. Now get me some backup people in here and get me more computing and communications capabilities. That was Apollo 13. Well, within the next hour, we finally got the crew over the lunar module and started the power down. But most importantly, I had to make the decision, how are we going to come home? Are we going to come around the front side of the moon? To do this, I'm going to have to jettison my lunar module, use my big engine and the majority of the propellant. But if that maneuver is not executed perfectly, will probably impact the moon. The other option, I'm going to have to go completely around the moon. It's going to take between 4 and 5 days to get back home. And to the best of my knowledge, we have enough electrical power for 2 people for 2 days. And that was the direction I chose. And that then set the stage for everything else. My team has finally accomplished over to Luddy's team. He's immediately challenged because the third fuel cell is now failing. He's got 15 minutes. So he scrambles the crew over to complete the power up, but most importantly, he has to transfer the navigation data from the command module computer, which is going to die, and put it over in the lunar module computer. We didn't have a data bus transfer capable in those days. All the computations for that transfer are pencil and paper, and they must be perfect. I'm walking downstairs where my Tiger team is forming up. We go through a lot of discussion, but we finally break the problems down to our batteries may freeze, propellant may freeze, water system may freeze, large number of survival issues, how do we navigate, how to get through the Earth's atmosphere, and that's when I make this speech. Only it isn't like it is in the movie. We have never lost an American in space, and we sure as hell aren't going to lose one now. This crew is coming home. But you got to believe it, your team must believe it, and we must make it happen. And from that moment forward, this team had their direction. Over the next 4 days, they pulled off America. Well, basically, a young gentleman by the name of John Aaron. You've seen him very well depicted in the movie. He's given the job to use all the resources to figure out how to get us home on the lunar module resources. John stands up in the meeting and says, Flight, 2 things we got to do immediately. We got to cut a day off the return journey. I said, okay, John, I'll work on that one. What's the other? We got to power down the navigation system displays in the computer. And I say, John, that one's not in the cards. And he says, why, Flight? Because that is the biggest power user in the spacecraft. I say, John, we normally navigate the stars, but we can no longer see stars. All we can clearly identify is the sun, the earth, and the moon. So my trajectory team gets the job to come up with new ways to navigate that are sufficient for performing maneuvers. We got to get it done in 18 hours using sun, earth, and moon. And we eventually use sun. I picked up the job to get us home a day early, and I saw that lunar module, the engines you had out there. Basically, we're going to use the engine that we would have used to actually land on the moon. Only this time we're going to use it to increase our forward velocity by roughly about 1,000 feet per second. And we can cut a day off the return journey. Now, Lundy's team has had the crew perform a small maneuver. We have a ground rule and mission control, much like the military, no man left behind. So after this maneuver, we're bringing the crew back to Earth. It's going to be too late, but at least we've added finality into the mission. We have our first press conference. Chris covers the press conference. At the conclusion of the press conference, they're given the opportunity to come over into mission control and start reporting live from mission control. So now we have people from the newspapers, radio, and basically television sitting over in the corner of my room, and we're literally living in a fishbowl. Everything that we're saying and everything that we're doing is being reported live to the world as it is happening. One of the real miracles of Apollo 13 was the discipline of the flight control teams. My job as lead flight director was to get my team out of the rotation, start working the problem, and the rest of the teams came in, and literally at every 8-hour interval, we changed teams so that we always had a fresh team on site, ready to do the job. 24 hours after the explosion, we're back in mission control, getting ready for the get home fast maneuver. The spacecraft is passed behind the moon. As it comes out the backside of the moon, we execute this maneuver. We've got a power management plan in work. And as soon as maneuver is complete, when it started, we were watching the engine. It was fishtailing, it wasn't thrusting properly. And all of a sudden it settles down and starts thrusting correctly. And after the maneuver, we get the cruise post-burn report, and now we recognize our mistake. We had computed the engine trim wrong because we had assumed 2 crewmen would be in the lunar module, 1 crewman would be in the command module. So from now on in mission control, there will be no more assumptions. Well, the maneuver changed our landing point from the Indian Ocean over to the South Pacific near Samoa, and we sent the aircraft carrier Iwo Jima to the landing location. And now the only management flap of Apollo 13 begins, and there was only one. Dick Slayton comes up to me at the console and says, look, I want you to get my crew to sleep. They're too darn tired, they're going to make a mistake. And about the time I get his input, my boss, Chris Kraft, says, nope, you got to get the spacecraft power down, you're using too much energy. And about the time he finishes, Max Fazi chimes in. Max says, nope. He says, what you got to do is you got to restore thermal balance to the spacecraft. And that was the track we were already going down because we'd been tracking temperatures from the previous 24 hours. On the sun side, the temperatures averaged roughly about 150 degrees, and the dark side was minus 180, so we had a 330-degree temperature gradient there. And everything on the dark side was freezing up, and they were worried about some structural deformation there. Now, the only source we have of energy is the sun, so what we must do is invent a barbecue-type maneuver to spin the spacecraft on its axis perpendicular to the sun line so the sun can heat all sides. And we've never done this before using the lunar module thrusters because they're essentially in the center of gravity. So for about a 45-minute to an hour period of time, we're literally conducting a physics experiment in space. We have the crew firing 1 thruster, combinations of thrusters. We nail down the duration and the direction we wanted to fire until we finally feel we got all the piece parts down. We write it the sequence, voice it up to the crew, and it doesn't work. We look back over the procedure, we're convinced the crew must have missed a step. So this time we talk them through very, very, very slowly. And now the spacecraft's spinning perfectly on its axis, sun heating all sides. Now we can get some rest. We've been operating about 60 hours continuously by this time. And we can power down the spacecraft. We bring it down to about 100 watts, which is just enough to operate a small fan and provide power for communications, and we know it's going to get as cold as a meat locker inside the spacecraft. While we're doing all of this, engineering's looked and they see another problem that we hadn't yet anticipated is the crew is going to suffer from carbon dioxide poisoning very soon. We use a chemical canister in the lunar module. It's packed in a cylindrical canister. Contains, oh gee whiz, I remember the stuff. Anyway, I forget what the chemical is. I'll remember in a minute. Anyway, it's packed in the cylinder there, and we only have enough of those for 2 people for 2 days. So now the carbon dioxide partial pressure is going up. The crew is about 10 hours from expiring due to carbon dioxide poison. We got plenty of square scrubbers, however, over in the dead command module. So engineering comes up with a fix to fit the square scrubber in the round hole using a cardboard cover from the flight plan, a big plastic baggie we have on board. We use the sock as a filter to remove any solids that might be getting in there, lash it together with duct tape, test in the laboratories, it works like a champ. And about the time my team's come in from a rest period, they're passing the instructions up to the crew to build not 1 but 2 of these devices so they can clean the atmosphere as rapidly as possible. About the time that problem's fixed, my team comes in, and return status is not very encouraging. It's getting much colder in the spacecraft than we had expected it to. And water system's freezing up, so we have the crew transferring water to baggies so they'll have something to drink and rehydrate the food. The Navy tells me a typhoon is developing in the exact landing area and bringing the spacecraft back to it. They want me to change my landing point. But the problem that gets my attention is my trajectory team tells me we're going to miss the Earth. Now, when we come back to Earth, we have to fly down a 2.5-degree wide cone-shaped corridor. If we come in too shallow, we're going to skip off the Earth's atmosphere and we'll go into an eternal orbit between the Earth and the Moon, never come back. Come in too steep, we're going to burn up in about 45 to 60 seconds, just like Shuttle Columbia did a few years ago. But again, the team has figured out a way to perform a maneuver. We tell the crew to rotate the spacecraft so they can see the Earth outside the 2 triangular windows in the lunar module. And on each one of these windows is a device, we call it a COAS, but basically it's a telescope that we use during rendezvous and docking and for lunar navigation. We tell the crew to align the y-axis crosshair in that telescope on the Earth's terminator, which is the line that separates daylight from darkness as you're looking at the Earth from space. And in that orientation, the engine will be properly positioned to correct our trajectory. Then we say, Jim, once you're in this orientation, looking through your sighting device and with your primary hand controller, when the engine starts, you keep the Earth from moving up and down. And Fred Hayes, looking through your sighting device with your backup hand controller, you keep the Earth from moving from left to right. And we tell Swigert to put 14 seconds in his wristwatch, and that is the entire procedure. Crew talks it over amongst themselves for a few minutes, and we hear them call out engine start. And doggone it, to catch on this control technique pretty quick. 14 seconds later, we hear shutdown. We track them for a half hour. This technique got them right back within the proper reentry corridor. Now, the crew has nothing to do over the next 24 hours except watch Earth grow larger and larger and larger and wonder how we're going to get them back through the Earth's atmosphere. And you're familiar with the configuration we're in. We got the lemon, it's sort of like a dumbbell. We got lemon on one end and basically the service module on the other end with the command module in the middle. Command module is our reentry vessel. As we enter into the Earth's atmosphere, we have to maneuver into an orientation so we can explosively separate these 3 pieces so they'll follow different reentry trajectories. But before we do that, we have to evacuate from the lunar module, get into the command module, rapidly and efficiently power it up, initialize computer, close hatch, check orientation, and start blowing the pieces apart. This will turn into a checklist that's about 500 entries long. I walk over to the simulator at about landing minus 24 to see how it's going. They've got several astronauts over there. Ken Mattingly, Gene Kranz, and Tom Stafford are the principal ones working over there. And basically, Ken Mattingly walks up and he says, Flight, I think the procedures are ready to go, but what I'd recommend as a final check in these procedures is that we give them to a crewman who has never seen them and have him go through it for a final time. I agree that's a good final cross-check of the procedures, so we reset the deadline back to landing minus 18. And that's basically where we are right now. At 18, we started voicing up instructions to the crew. We worked with Swigert for about 2 hours. He reads back to us. We're pretty much convinced he understands his part of the job in the command module. Then we start working with Fred Hayes, and unknown to us on the ground, Fred's getting pretty sick. Both crewmen are hugging him, trying to get some heat into him because he's got uncontrollable shivers, bad urinary infection, dehydrated, body temperature is increasing. But Fred was the guy that must do the job. We voice the instructions up to him, and then we power down to get a few hours rest before we come in for our final shift. I always had my shift go through sort of what I'd say a cycle. Mental review of all the things that they must do in this particular shift in order for us to see what the objectives are for the shift. For the shift, when they're ready, they come in, give me a green light indicator from the console. When I have an all-green board, I send my flight surgeon around to interview them to see if they're going to need a stimulant to keep them going for the final hours. Virtually all of the controllers refuse. They're going to do it on black coffee and cigarettes. I put on my white vest, which has been my team's trademark since the early days in space. Then I pull my controllers for the starter shift status. And they report in, they're sharp, they're crisp, they're on top of the job. And I'm so down prior to these kids, I could croak, and then I get concerned now it's the adrenaline, we're peaking too soon. Don't even have that luxury. My trajectory controller, Jerry Bostic's walking up from the front of the room. And I know he doesn't have any good news for me. He leans over the console and says, Flight, I didn't want to tell you this in the loop, but we got to perform an emergency maneuver. We're going to miss the Earth. So now we have to use our very precious electrical power. We voice the instructions up to the crew to power up the land guidance computer. They execute the maneuver. And then as soon as we get that sorted out, it's time to start the power up of the command module. And there's water all over inside the spacecraft, hanging from the switches, the circuit breakers, light bulbs. You can't believe how much condensed moisture is in there. And a lot of the worrywart are worrying about some internal shorts in the spacecraft, but basically that's beyond our ability to control it. And the next event is for the service module to be jettisoned, and the crew calls off service module jettison. And there's about a 45-second pause as they maneuver into position to give us a report. And then they start reporting, okay, I've got her, the whole side of the spacecraft's missing all the way to the high gain antenna. The whole side is missing to the base of the engine. And the phrase Hayes says, yeah, it looks like I might have got the engine too. There's nothing out there but a dark brown streak by the injector. And as I think back to the decision to go around the moon, I had no data. All I had was a gut feeling. And many of my controllers have experienced this. There's some point in the mission where you've done the best you can for the crew of the mission. Then it's time to hand it off to higher authority to bring this mission to its ultimate conclusion. We now continue the power up the spacecraft, and now you can start feeling the emotional content of this room building up, because this team is sensing victory, and we're about 1 hour from bringing this crew home. And the emotion content peaks about the time we jettison the lunar module, because we start speaking to it. We say farewell Aquarius, we thank you, we're one hell of a good ship. And then we blow the explosive bolts. It's going to tumble and disintegrate before it hits the Pacific. And then I start my final poll of the controllers to give them the crew the go for entry. And just as I start, I'm interrupted. Controller comes to me and he says, "Flight, we got to get the crew quick. Battery C's failing. We need power for the parachutes." So we voice the instructions up to the crew to pull Battery C offline, redistribute it to A and B across the buses to make power for the chutes. And now it's a very difficult time to talk because the entire world is listening to everything that we are saying. And finally, the rookie astronaut on board the spacecraft calls down and he says, "You know, all of us up here want to thank you guys down there for the great job you did." And then we get attaboy from both Lovell and Hayes, and then we respond in a similar fashion, and all of a sudden there's a burst of static, and I get a call, "Flight, we've had loss of signal, we're in blackout." A blackout is the time period where the fire of entry prevents communications with the crew. At this stage of the space program, we could compute when it would start and when it would finish within a second, and we've never missed. And blackout's a very difficult time for every controller because there's only one thought in each controller's mind. Did I give the crew everything I needed to? Was my data right? Because from now on, she's on their own, no more givebacks. And as the end of blackout approaches, every controller's eyes and the clocks on the wall counting down to 0. And when it finally hits 0, blackout should be over, and I say, "Okay, you'll give a call." And Herman calls, "Obviously, Houston's standing by." We get no response from the crew. All we hear is static. We call again, we call again, and now it's 1 minute since we should have heard from this crew. And for the first time, doubt is moving into this room, and we keep calling. And 1 minute and 27 seconds after we should have heard, Gray Hope downrange aircraft calls out a rapport as acquisition signal. Then the aircraft carrier reports a radar contact, then a sonic boom. Then in mission control, we see this beautiful picture of the spacecraft out of these 3 red and white parachutes, and the emotional release at that instant is so intense that literally everyone is standing crying. You're frankly embarrassed by your loss of composure. You pull yourself together, get back to work. Spacecraft hits the water, remains upright. Iwo Jima circles, deploys more helicopters. Parajumpers going to bring the crew out. And this crew that had been living in the meat locker, temperatures range from 35 to 37 for the best part of four days, extremely humid. And basically all they had was a light cotton cover, all they had inside the spacecraft. But these guys are now in the warm air of the South Pacific. And they are home, and they're alive. Now, our job is not over until we hand over responsibility for this crew to the Recovery Task Force Commander. As soon as the cruise speed hit that carrier deck, we start handing over. And once it is complete, and only when it's complete, do we begin our celebration. By now, we have pre-positioned about 700 of the best cigars we can find. They run from the west coast of the United States all the way to the east coast of the United States. And on national TV, we count down to light up those stogies, and that was probably the sweetest smoke that any of us have ever had. Second phase in celebration is to back out of a condition we call battle short. During critical mission phases, we physically block all power breakers coming into the building, and we lock the doors of the main control rooms. And now with the control room doors open, our backroom controllers come in and join us, and these are the real heroes of all 13, because they're the folks that gave us the answers we needed when we needed them. All we did in the main control room was count cadence and assemble the pieces into the proper sequence. Third phase in celebration is a tradition we started when we set our first space flight record as Americans. We passed out an American flag to every controller. And on the staff of that flag, you write your name, you write the mission, you write the landing time of the job that you were doing in mission control. And we continued this tradition all the way through, from the Gemini rendezvous mission all the way through to the early shuttle. And these flags are probably our most treasured possessions. President Nixon came down, visited us in Houston. We got some nice attaboys, and then went out to give the crew the recognition that they deserved 2 days later out in Hawaii. And can't really say enough for the performance of this crew, because the relationship that existed, both pre-mission as well as during the mission, between the ground team and the crew in space was one of absolute trust, and without this trust, we would have never made it. A few words about the flight directors. I always operated with 4 flight control teams. Glenn Lunny, he is the leader of the black team, was the youngest at 32. Came to us as an engineer from the University of Detroit and was the first person I ever knew who worked with a computer. So he was the go-to guy to get the answers out of the machines that we needed. He had worked with co-op at NASA up at Langley for a while. I was the oldest of the flight directors at 37. Team color white, Milt Woodward, team color maroon, Jerry Griffin gold. The remaining 3 of us were all fighter pilots. We flew the late subsonic and early supersonic aircraft in the 50s. I believe it was this background in jet aviation at that time. It was really helped us keep our poise during the course of the mission. Gene Cernan was the last human ever to walk on the moon surface on Apollo 817. And for us, this was a marvelous time because we believed in this dream that we were given by John F. Kennedy, and we considered ourselves privileged and proud to be part of the brotherhood that formed in the early years of spaceflight. We thanked our country every day that gave us a chance to participate in this great adventure. So this is the story of Apollo 13, but it's really a story of a team of young Americans united through leadership, trust, and values. And a team that truly believes that in our line of work, failure is not an option. That's it. There's a lot of it was interesting. This wasn't the end of the sagas from the Apollo missions. One of the more interesting ones, I imagine a lot of you people work with computers. Well, in the Apollo 14, how Apollo 14 got to the moon is very interesting. Because on the final pass in front of the moon before the crew, Alan Shepard and Ed Mitchell would ignite the engine that go down to the lunar surface. One of my controllers looked up and noticed that the abort indication was on in his console, and he knew there was no test of the abort switch there. So he went into his backroom controller. The backroom controller said, "Looks like it's a valid indication to me." They went to the telemetry soup. Telemetry soup indicated it was a valid indication. So then very quickly, they got together with the engineering community, and the engineering community says, "You know, a long time ago, I saw one of these alert buttons that said we might have some contaminated switches on board the lunar module." So Dick Thorson comes up, says, "Flight, would you have the crew wrapping the abort switch with his flashlight?" This is in front of the whole world, so they wrap it, and the abort indication goes away. Over the next, we only had one more chance to land. One more landing opportunity. In the next 2 hours, we wrote a software patch to bypass the abort switch during engine start. And once we verified that the abort indication was not present, we would re-enable all the stuff we just disabled. And this really just about took IBM off the wall with this inventing a patch in this period of time without ever having to simulate it. And we actually voiced it up. The crew had come around the front side of the moon now after we had waved them off, and we started voicing up this set of instructions that would allow them to get down to the surface of the moon. Apollo 15 was very interesting because we learned about the absolute limits of human endurance and performance. We had 3 crewmen out at the surface after the 3 EVAs with the rover, totally dehydrated to the point where their blood potassium level had changed. Okay, this ended up in some very exciting times in mission control. Apollo 16, we had problems with this is Ken Mattingly finally got a chance to fly. He's going to be in the command module. He finally got a chance to develop workaround procedure for the service propulsion engine so that we have a backup capability to go into the moon. But basically, this was our job in mission control. We never really looked at it as anything that was, you know, exceptional. This was the job that we were trained and paid to do. And it was funny, when the Apollo 13 movie came out, we were sort of surprised that they were making a big deal out of this. But it turned out to be pretty neat. They made a great movie out of it. Okay, any questions? We got maybe 10 minutes there. Boy, I can't say this. Okay, I'll tell you the story about the vests. The vests were true. When I was flying, my wife would always make me some fancy scarves. And my other pilots I flew with really thought this was pretty cool. So pretty soon she started making scarves for the other pilots that I was flying with. And when it came time for me to fly my first mission as flight director, my team color was white. The first 3 flight directors, Chris Kraft got red, John Hodge and Englishman blue, and then I got white. My wife says, you know, you need some kind of an identifier for your team. Basically, you got to find some way to get the unity you're going to need as a team to get the job done. So she suggested making a vest. I didn't think too much of it, but she made it, so I decided I better wear it. And basically, she would make a brand new one, always white, different fabric, different pattern for each flight until I got to the Gemini 9 mission. Gemini 9 was a basket case. We were using the Gene as a target vehicle. The first one blew up shortly after liftoff. The second one, we invented this thing called the Gene target docking adapter to use as a target. And that was the famous mission that's got the alligator, jaws open, can't get it out. Couldn't do the docking thing right on the line, but we did all kinds of neat rendezvous and all that kind of stuff. And I came home when the mission was just about over and said, Marty, would you make me a celebration vest? And I said, I don't have any material. Well, I went and got a few hours rest, came back down the next morning. I had a beautiful gold and silver brocade on white silk. And basically, when I come back from Korea, I brought her back one of these beautiful robes, and she cut the bottom part about this thing off and made the vest. Well, we ended up with about 40-some vests by the time that I finished flying. And we got 6 kids, 5 girls, so a lot of them went to Girl Scout raffles. And they raised maybe $50 total. And then before the movie came out, I needed to clean some out, so I got rid of some more to the rag bag down at the thrift shop. Well, all of a sudden the movie comes out, and Hollywood's interested in this vest thing. And before I can send the vest out to them via parcel post, I got to have it appraised. So the appraiser gives it $15,000. And then realized all the stuff that went away. My wife Marta has a beautiful one. The gold and silver brocade one is up in the Smithsonian right now. Excuse me, that was the George Bush Library. The white one, the Apollo 13 one's up in the Smithsonian. They did a nice piece on her. So she's really a neat lady who, after 55 years of marriage, still is willing to put up with my idiosyncrasies. I think that's it. Any other questions? Thank you very much.